How did a person, clothed only in wool and animal hide, sleep soundly through a night where the very air could freeze them solid? We often picture the Viking age, full of fire and fury, of longships and shining steel. But tonight, we are exploring a quieter, far more intimate story. It is a story of their mastery over a world of ice. Before we join them in the frozen wild, if you enjoy these journeys into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It truly helps us build this community, and I am always so curious to know where our stories are heard. So please, feel free to share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let's begin our journey. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we travel back to a snow-covered forest in 9th century Norway to understand the ingenious and often forgotten ways the Norse people survived the deep cold. Our story begins in an old, silent forest. It was a deep, padded silence that seemed to soak up all sound, broken only by the sharp, crisp crunch of long wooden skis gliding over dry, packed snow. The air itself was so cold it felt thin in the lungs, and each breath from the three figures plumed in front of them, hanging in the still, frigid air like white ghosts. This was the high fells, many miles from their small fjord-side settlement, a world of ancient pine, cold stone, and deep snow. Our travelers are a small hunting party. There is Leif, broad-shouldered and steady, his beard thick with frost. There is Kettle, the youngest, his eyes still wide with the quiet awe of the deep wilderness. And then there is Astrid, who moves with an easy, practiced grace, her gaze constantly scanning the trees, her knowledge of this land absolute. They are not warriors, not raiders. Like most Norse people, their lives were tied to the land. They were farmers in the short, bright summer, and hunters in the long, dark winter. This hunt was essential. The salted fish and dried meats in the longhouse were plentiful, but the winter was long. Fresh meat was a necessity, a vital surge of strength and sustenance. More than that, the winter furs were at their thickest and most valuable. The pelts of marten, fox, or the reindeer they were tracking were high-value trade goods, a link to the world far beyond their fjord. And so they had traveled far, deep into the wildlands. They moved across the landscape on their skis, or skid, as they called them. These were not the short, identical skis we might imagine today. They were a specialized, ingenious pair. One ski was long and smooth, a glider, allowing Leif to slide effortlessly over the drifts. The other was shorter, and its underside was covered in thick animal fur, perhaps sealskin or reindeer hide. This was the trogger, the kicking ski, its furred surface gripping the snow to propel him forward. It was a brilliant, efficient way to travel, far faster than wading through the deep drifts. Their equipment was simple, honed by generations of use. They carried long yew boughs, powerful enough to bring down an elk. At their hips, they carried spears with sharp iron heads, and on their leather belts, the seeks. This was the all-purpose knife of the Norse world, a long, heavy blade that was part tool, part weapon. It could chop wood, skin an animal, or defend its owner. They were deep in the Utmark, the outfields. This was the Norse concept of the wilderness, the untamed world that lay beyond the inmark, the enclosed, civilized fields and pastures of their farm. The inmark was safe. The Utmark was the domain of wild beasts, and perhaps, as the stories told, of other, older things. But Leif and Astrid were masters of the Utmark. They navigated not by maps, but by memory and the subtle signs of the world around them. They used the low, pale arc of the winter sun. They followed the spine of a familiar ridge, guiding themselves by prominent rock formations that looked like a sleeping troll or a broken tooth. They followed the faint, frozen trails of the very animals they hunted. Their clothing was their first layer of defense against the biting cold. They wore tunics and trousers made of thick, coarse wool. This wool was rich in natural lanolin, the oil from the sheep, which made it remarkably water-resistant. On their feet were soft hide boots, but the true secret was inside. Their boots were stuffed with dried cinnagrace, a specific type of sedge grass. This grass, when dried, was incredibly light and airy, and it wickeded moisture away from their feet, trapping warm air. It was a far better insulator than any wool sock. Over it all, they wore thick cloaks of hide or heavy wool, fastened at the shoulder with a simple pin. This was a small, trusted team. A winter hunt in the Utmark was dangerous, and you only traveled with those whose skill and nerve you trusted with your life. Kettle, though young, was Leif's nephew and learning quickly. Astrid was perhaps the most skilled hunter in their entire settlement, and with them, padding silently on the snow, was Astrid's hunting dog, a sharp-eared Spitz. Its senses were a vital extension of their own, its nose able to find a trail that human eyes would miss completely. The scent of pine resin from the trees and the clean metallic smell of cold stone filled the air. The light, already fading in this northern winter afternoon, was flat and gray, painting the world in shades of white and charcoal. Their hunt had been successful. They had tracked and brought down a large reindeer, and the best cuts of meat were now securely wrapped and fastened to a small sledge Leif was pulling. They were tired but satisfied. The long trek home had begun. They were moving through a grove of thick pines when Astrid, who was leading, suddenly stopped. She held up a hand, and Leif and Kettle glided to a halt behind her. The forest, which had been so deeply silent, seemed to have become even quieter. The distant call of a raven they had heard earlier was gone. Astrid looked up, past the canopy of the trees, to the small patch of sky visible. It had changed. The wind, she said, her voice quiet. Leif listened. He could hear it now. It was not the gentle sigh of a breeze. It was a low, distant moan, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And the light, which had been flat and gray, was now taking on a sickly, yellowish hue. He had seen this before. He looked to where the sun should be and saw a sundog, a pale, ghostly echo of light beside the real sun. It was a beautiful and deeply worrying sign. The animals of the forest, with their older, deeper senses, had already felt the change. They had vanished, gone to ground, seeking whatever shelter they could find. Then it hit them. It was not a gradual increase. It was a sudden, violent shift. The low moan became a high-pitched whistle, and then a deafening, shrieking roar. The wind tore through the trees, sending showers of snow and ice needles cascading down. This was a snowstorm, a Nordic blizzard, infamous for its speed and ferocity. The temperature, already well below freezing, plummeted. It was a physical, painful drop. Leif could feel his exposed cheeks sting, and then, alarmingly, begin to go numb. The first ice needles of the storm, as the blueprint notes, began to fly. This was not the soft, fluffy snow of a gentle winter's day. It was hard, dry, and sharp, and it hit any exposed skin with 1,000 stinging pinpricks. The world vanished. The trees, just 20 feet away, became hazy shadows, and then disappeared entirely into a churning, swirling wall of white. This was the Senjofok, the whiteout. It was the primary danger, the thing that led to complete and utter disorientation. In seconds, their world had shrunk to a space of only a few feet. All landmarks were gone. The familiar rock formations, the ridges, the very concept of direction, all of it was erased. The psychological shift was brutal. Moments ago, they were confident hunters, masters of their environment, heading home with their prize. Now, they were vulnerable, fragile humans, lost in a blinding, roaring chaos. The wind shrieked, a sound the Norse sometimes called skriking, like the cries of angry spirits. This was Dragavir ghost weather, when the air itself became thick and alive, hostile and confusing. Leif could feel his heavy wool cloak, still damp with the faint steam from his body, beginning to stiffen with frost. It was becoming a suit of icy armor. He turned to look for Astrid and Kettle, and his heart jumped. They were only 5 feet away, but they were already fading, becoming indistinct shapes in the maelstrom. He knew, with a cold certainty, that they could not make it home. They could not even make it to the sheltered grove they had passed a mile back. To move was to risk separating, to risk walking in a blind circle until exhaustion took them. They had to survive, here, wherever here was. Stay close, Leif roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. Grab my cloak, Astrid, grab Kettle. We must find shelter, now. The priority was singular. Get out of the wind. The scramble began. It was frantic, but it was not panic. It was the controlled, desperate work of people who understood the stakes. Leif abandoned the sledge with the reindeer meat. It was meaningless now. Only life mattered. Kettle, blinded by the swirling snow and deafened by the wind, stumbled. His breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. He was showing the first signs of panic, the kind that could freeze a man's mind before the cold froze his body. Astrid, her face, a mask of snow and ice, grabbed the back of his tunic with a grip of iron. Her voice was firm, a sharp, steadying word that cut through his fear. Kettle, stay with me. We are not done. Leif, at the front, was now their anchor. He held his long ski pole, not as a ski, but as a probe. They could not see, so they had to feel. They moved as one, holding onto each other's cloaks, a tiny island of humanity in the white chaos. Leif was searching for a specific type of terrain. He was looking for a scavel, a large, deep snowdrift, or a granite rock face, or a depression in the terrain. Anything that broke the wind. He probed ahead, testing the snow. He had to be careful. The deep snows hid dangers, like tree wells. These were hidden, suffocating pits of loose, unconsolidated snow that formed around the base of large spruce trees. To fall into one was to be buried alive. He kept them moving, his feet feeling for the slope of the land. The wind was a physical pressure, a roaring, shoving giant that tried to tear them apart. Leif felt the snow piling up on his shoulders and the hood of his cloak. He was breathing through his woolen scarf, but the supercooled air still burned his lungs. The wind chill was the true killer. The temperature might be -20, but with this wind, it was like -40 or -50. It was a cold that did not just chill the skin. It stole the heat from the very core of the body, a relentless, lethal theft. Then, Leif's probing ski pole hit something solid. He shuffled forward. Rock, a granite rock face, and piled against it, just as he had hoped, was a massive drift. The wind, hitting the rock, had slowed and dumped its load of snow, creating a deep, packed mound. This was the spot. This was their chance. Leif understood the concept of the vindaga, the wind eye. They would not try to build asterisk against asterisk the wind. That was impossible. They would build asterisk with asterisk it. They would use the very drift the storm had created, letting the wind continue to pile snow up and over them, burying them, insulating them. "Here!" he yelled, his voice torn away by the gale. He did not need to be heard. He pointed. He shoved them toward the base of the drift. The tools they had were few, but they were enough. They had their seek's knives. Leif had a small, sharp wood-cutting axe on his belt, and they had their gloved and quickly numbing hands. The physical exertion would be immense, all while being battered by the storm. But they had no choice. Leif's commands were sharp, movements more than sounds. Dig. They began to dig for their lives. They would create a sinjahola, a snow hole. We might think of it as a quincy, an idea understood by all northern peoples. They did not dig aimlessly. They worked as a team. Leif used his small axe to chop at the wind-packed crust of the drift, breaking it into rough blocks. Kettle, his panic now replaced by the focusing power of an impossible task, used his hands and his seeks to claw the looser snow out. They were digging asterisk into asterisk the drift, tunneling into the white. The principle of this shelter was simple, and it was brilliant. Snow itself is one of the world's best insulators. It is not the ice crystals that insulate, but the vast, microscopic pockets of air trapped between them. The wind was the killer. By burrowing into the snow, they were not just escaping the wind. They were wrapping themselves in a blanket of trapped air. They worked in frantic shifts. Leif would dig for a few minutes, then Astrid would take over, while Leif cleared the snow from the entrance. They had to be careful of a new danger: sweat. To overheat now, to soak their wool tunics with sweat, would be a death sentence. Wet clothes lose all their insulating power and would freeze solid the moment they stopped moving. So they worked in bursts, opening their cloaks to vent the heat, then closing them again. The scrape of the axe on the packed snow, the muffled grunts of effort, these were the only sounds in their immediate world. The roar of the blizzard was already fading, muffled by the growing walls of snow around them. They followed a specific technique. Leif dug asterisk in asterisk for several feet, and then, crucially, he began to dig asterisk up asterisk. Their sleeping platform, where they would huddle, had to be asterisk higher asterisk than the entrance. This was the key. Warm air rises. Any body heat they generated would rise and be trapped in the small, domed chamber they were carving out. Just inside the low entrance tunnel, Leif dug a small pit, a cold sink. He knew that the coldest, heaviest air, as well as the carbon dioxide from their own breath, would fall and gather in this pit, keeping the sleeping platform above it relatively warmer. It was an incredibly clever piece of thermal engineering, learned through generations of survival. Outside, the temperature was plummeting, perhaps to -20 or -30 degrees Celsius. It was a lethal, unsurvivable cold. But inside this tiny snow cave, their combined body heat, trapped by the insulating snow, could raise the temperature to 0 degrees Celsius, or even slightly above. Freezing, yes, but freezing was paradise. Freezing was life, when compared to the howling death just a few feet away. The space was tiny. It was just big enough for the three of them and the dog to huddle together, sharing their warmth. They were racing against time. Kettle's fingers were numb. Leif could feel the telltale wooden stiffness in his own toes. Exhaustion and frostbite were closing in. Enough, Leaf said, his voice now clear in the muffled confines of the hole. Astrid, who was outside, crawled into the low tunnel. Before she came in all the way, she used her spear, poking it up through the roof of the dome, once, twice, creating a small, vital ventilation hole. Without it, they could suffocate on their own breath, the carbon dioxide building up silently as they slept. Leaf and Kettle crawled up onto the small platform. Astrid passed the dog in, and it immediately curled into a tight, shivering ball. Then Astrid herself crawled in. The last act was to seal the entrance. Leaf had cut a large block of snow for this purpose. He reached down into the tunnel, pulled it into place, and packed the gaps with loose snow, and then silence. The sudden, shocking absence of sound was overwhelming. The blizzard, which moments before had been a physical, roaring monster trying to tear them apart, was gone. It was reduced to a dull, low, distant rumble, a sound felt more than heard. They were inside. They were out of the wind. The only light was a faint, ghostly blue filtering through the packed snow walls. The air smelled of damp wool, of pine resin from their clothes, and the faint, animal scent of human effort. The immediate, violent crisis had passed. The feeling of relief was so profound it was almost dizzying. They had used their tools, their knowledge, and their will to build a tiny bubble of life inside a world of death. The shelter was built, but the blizzard raged on, and the long, cold, dark night had only just begun. The crisis of survival had shifted from frantic action to quiet, cold endurance. As they settle into their hastily built shelter, the immediate danger has passed, but the long wait begins. This story of survival is just one of many from the Viking Age. If there are other parts of their world, or another historical period entirely, you'd be curious to explore in a future story, please let me know in the comments. I always love seeing your ideas. Now, let's see how they face the coming darkness. The work of frantic action was over. The building was done. Now, inside the cramped, blue-white dimness of the snow hole, the nature of their survival shifted. It was no longer a battle of strength against the storm, but a quiet, intimate test of endurance. The focus moved from active, desperate labor to a passive, critical waiting. Here, in this tiny pocket of stillness carved from the blizzard, the true genius of their preparedness would be revealed. Their lives now depended on the intimate technology they carried on their backs and in their small, frozen satchels. This was the long night. This was the test of warmth. They settled onto the bed of pine boughs, the platform they had built to keep their bodies off the snow. The space was barely large enough for the three of them and the dog. Kettle, the youngest, was already shivering, his teeth chattering softly. Astrid moved to sit beside him, while Bjorn, positioned near the entrance, began to unpack their small leather bags. The sound was sharp in the muffled quiet. It was the sound of frozen leather, crinkling like stiff parchment as his cold fingers worked the ties. The faint gray light from the snow-plugged entrance was just enough to see by. It was a weak, spectral light, casting no real shadows, only deepening the sense of being buried alive. Bjorn's large hands were careful. He pulled out his fire-starting kit first. This was a motion of habit, of hope. He held the components in his palm. There was a fire steel, a simple, curved bar of iron. There was a jagged piece of sharp flint, and there was a small, dry pouch of tinder. This tinder was likely amadou, a prized material shaved from a hoof fungus, carefully charred to catch a spark instantly. A metallic click echoed in the tiny space. Bjorn struck the steel against the flint. Once, twice, a tiny, fleeting spark jumped bright orange against the blue gloom. It was a comforting sound, a reminder of home, of hearths, of safety. But it was a hollow comfort. They all knew the problem. There was no dry wood. The pine boughs beneath them were green and damp with resin. To burn them would fill the tiny space with acrid, blinding smoke. And more, a significant fire asterisk in asterisk, the snow hole was a terrible risk. It would consume their precious oxygen, replacing it with deadly, odorless gas. It would also melt the walls of their shelter, weakening the roof and soaking them all in icy water. So, the fire steel was returned to its pouch. It was a tool of potential, but not of use. Not here, not now. Their survival would not come from a flame. Astrid, meanwhile, had opened her own satchel. She produced her own essential tool, one they could use. It was her seeks, the short, heavy-bladed knife that every Norse man and woman carried. Some called it a bringe. It was an all-purpose tool, a daily companion. She used its sharp edge to shave a few small, resinous splinters from a pine branch, the scent of fresh pine briefly filling the air. These they could chew, the resin providing a tiny, bitter burst of energy. Bjorn also produced a small, smooth whetstone. Even here, the discipline of the hunter held. A dull knife was a liability. He ran the blade of his own seeks across the stone a few times. A quiet, rhythmic asterisk, shing dash shing dash shing asterisk. It was another sound of order, a small defiance against the chaos howling outside. Then came the food. This was Kettle's focus. Bjorn unwrapped a piece of cloth to reveal the hard food, the rations of the trail. The smell that hit them was immediate and powerful. It was the sharp, salty sea smell of dried fish. This was stockfish, cod or haddock, dried rock hard in the cold northern air until it was almost wood. It was light to carry and lasted forever. Alongside it was dried meat, dark red jerky, tough and leathery. And there was flat broad, a thin, cracker-like bread, baked hard and dry. This was not a feast, it was fuel. It was calories, plain and simple, requiring long, hard chewing to soften. But it was life. Bjorn used his knife to break off pieces for each of them. Kettle took his eagerly, stuffing the hard fish into his mouth. Astrid watched him, her expression calm, encouraging. Finally, Bjorn pulled out his water skin. It was made of goat hide, and it was frozen solid. He passed it to Kettle, who tried to suckle at the wooden nozzle, but it was like drinking from a rock. The boy looked up, frustrated. This was perhaps the greatest danger after the cold itself. Thirst. But they could not simply eat the snow from the walls. This was a novice's mistake, a fatal error. Eating snow, as pristine as it looked, would be a disaster. It would steal their precious core body temperature, forcing their bodies to expend huge amounts of energy just to melt it. It was a fast track to hypothermia. The snow had to be melted first. But how, with no fire? The answer was their own bodies. Astrid took the frozen water skin and tucked it inside her clothing against her stomach. It would be a shock of intense cold against her skin. But her body heat, trapped by her layers, would slowly turn that ice back into life-giving water. It would take time. Until then, they had only the moisture from their small meal. The last items from the bags were for maintenance. Astrid pulled out a pair of spare hosen or socks. They were thick, rough wool, and crucially, they were dry. The feeling of that rough, dry wool against the skin was a small, deep luxury. She also had a small roll of vadmel, the ubiquitous homespun wool cloth, thick and dense, perfect for repairs, and with it, a small case carved from bone. Inside were needles, also of polished bone, and a tight spool of sinew thread made from the tough ligaments of deer. Even in a blizzard, stranded on a mountain, the expectation of mending torn gear remained. Preparedness was total. The satchels were tied shut. The inventory was complete. They had food, but it was hard. They had water, but it was frozen. They had tools, but no fire. Their primary source of heat, the furnace that would keep them alive through the long, dark hours, would have to come from their own bodies. And that heat, in turn, would be preserved by the remarkable, layered technology they were wearing. This clothing was not a simple matter of fashion. It was a survival system, refined over centuries of life and death in the unforgiving North. And the heart of this system, the true miracle fiber of the ancient world, was wool. Let us look deeper at the clothes on their backs. The layer closest to their skin was the serk, a long tunic, and the braer, a form of trousers. These were often made of linen in the summer, but here, in the deep winter, they were likely a very fine, soft wool. This base layer was the foundation of the entire system. Over this, they each wore a kirtle. This was a thicker, heavier wool tunic. Astrid's was a deep red, dyed with madder. Bjorn's was a simple, undyed brown. This was the primary insulation. But what made this wool so special? Why was it the key to their survival? The magic lies in the fiber itself. Wool is a bundle of contradictions. The asterisk, outside asterisk, of a wool fiber is hydrophobic, meaning it repels liquid water. Rain and snow tend to beat up and roll off. But the asterisk inside asterisk of the fiber, the core, is hygroscopic. This means it actively attracts and absorbs water asterisk, vapor asterisk. This is its genius. As a person works and sweats, their body releases moisture as vapor. This vapor is drawn asterisk into asterisk, the core of the wool fibers, leaving the surface of the fiber, the part touching the skin, to feel dry. In fact, a wool garment can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture without asterisk, feeling asterisk wet or cold to the touch. This was happening to them right now. They had sweated heavily while digging the coal, but the wool had wicked that dampness away from their skin, trapping it within the fibers themselves. This effect was enhanced by the natural grease in the wool, lanolin. Their vadmel, or homespun cloth, was likely minimally processed, retaining much of this waxy, sheepy-smelling substance. Lanolin provided a powerful, natural water resistance, a built-in defense against the wet. But the true secret to wool's warmth is its crimp. If you look at a single wool fiber, it is not straight, it is wavy, with a natural, repeating bend. When thousands of these fibers are spun into yarn and woven into cloth, these crimps create millions and millions of tiny, microscopic air pockets. It is not the wool itself that keeps a person warm. It is this trapped air. Air is one of the best insulators in the world. Their wool tunics were, in effect, a wearable layer of stationary, heated air, a personal atmosphere held close to the body. This is why, even as the blizzard raged, they were not yet freezing. Their body heat was being captured in these millions of tiny pockets. And what if the wool did get wet? Unlike linen, or the cotton we know today, wool asterisk insulates even when wet asterisk. A wet linen shirt is a death sentence. It clings to the skin and leaches heat away. A wet wool tunic, however, retains its structure. Those millions of air pockets, though damp, are still there. They still trap air. They still insulate. There is one more, almost magical property. It is called the heat absorption. When wool's hygroscopic core absorbs water vapor, like the sweat from their bodies, it triggers a tiny exothermic reaction. As the moisture settles into the fiber, the wool physically releases a small amount of heat. This means that as they sweated, their own clothing was actively, chemically, working to keep them warm. It was a slow, steady, and utterly reliable personal heater. This was not just any wool. It came from hardy, ancient sheep breeds, like the Spelzo. These sheep were, and still are, remarkable animals. Their fleece grows in 2 layers. There is a coarse, long outer tog, which is tough and water repellent, and a fine, soft inner thell, which provides the insulating down. When this dual fleece was woven into vadmel, the standard cloth of the Viking age, it was then fulled. This process involved beating the wet cloth, often with wooden hammers, to mat and compress the fibers. The result was an incredibly thick, dense, and nearly windproof textile. Inside the snow hole, they could feel this system at work. Their multiple layers felt heavy, scratchy, and damp, but it was a dampness that was not cold. The air they breathed out frosted instantly on their beards and hair. Ice crystals were visibly forming on the outside of their wool cloaks, a clear sign that their body heat was being successfully trapped inside. The only sound, besides the wind, was the faint rustling of these stiffened, heavy wool garments. Wool was their base system, their engine of warmth. But their outer layer, the shell that met the storm, was another specialized piece of technology. It was one designed to mimic the very animals that thrived in this impossible cold. This outer layer was the Veafelder. It was a heavy cloak, but a very special one. It was a shaggy cloak. During the weaving process, long, fleece-like tufts of unspun, greasy wool were woven directly into the fabric's structure. The result was a garment that looked and functioned remarkably like animal fur. This textile fur, with fines dating back centuries, was a brilliant piece of ancient biomimicry. The long, shaggy tufts trapped even more air, creating a deep, protective layer. And just like the fur of a wolf or a bear, it shed snow and water with ease. The snow did not melt and soak in. It rested on the outer tips of the shaggy fleece, where it could be easily brushed away. Their cloaks, matted with snow from their digging, were a testament to this design. They were the human equivalent of a thick animal pelt. While their torsos were protected by this incredible system, their extremities were the most vulnerable. Their footwear, consisted of simple leather score or shoes stitched from hide. These boots were now coarse and stiffened by the cold. Astrid, ever vigilant, reached down and began to gently remove Kettle's boots to check his feet. What she was looking for was the dreaded, white, waxy look of frostbite. But as she peeled back the boot and the wool sock, his foot was pale, cool, but dry. He wiggled his toes. She nodded, satisfied, and began to put his boot back on. But the wool sock was not their only, or even their most important, defense for their feet. The true secret weapon was hidden inside the boot itself. It was grass. This was not just any grass, scraped from the ground. It was sennegrass, known scientifically as Carex vesicaria. This specific bladder sedge grass was a crucial resource. It would be harvested in the summer, carefully dried and bundled, stored precisely for this purpose. Before putting on their boots, they would have stuffed handfuls of this dried, springy grass inside. The socks they wore were sometimes not even socks, but simple wool wrappings to hold the grass in place. Why this grass? It had incredible insulating properties, far superior to wool for this specific application. Its hollow, springy stems created a thick, airy cushion that surrounded the foot, trapping warmth. But like wool, it had a second, even more critical function. It wicked moisture. The foot is one of the sweatiest parts of the body. In the cold, that sweat is a mortal enemy. The sennegrass, however, would pull that moisture away from the skin, keeping the foot itself remarkably dry. This is not speculation. Archaeologists have found ancient leather shoes, like the famed Lona shoe, perfectly preserved in bogs. And when they opened them, they were found to be still stuffed with this exact species of grass. For Kettle and the others, the feeling was one of toasting grass. It was a dry, springy, and surprisingly warm sensation inside the stiff leather. The faint, sweet, hay-like smell of the dried grass was a subtle reminder of summer, a scent of life in a world of ice. Astrid finished with Kettle and checked her own feet. They too were dry and pale, not the angry red or blue of encroaching frost. Their clothing was a complete marvel of natural technology. They were wearing layers of trapped air, waterproofed with lanolin, chemically heated by their own sweat, and wrapped in a textile fur to shed the snow. Their feet were nestled in a bed of insulating, moisture-wicking grass. They were as prepared as any human could be. Now they had to combine this personal technology with the most ancient survival technique of all, shared warmth. The small group began to arrange itself for the long night. This was not a random tumble of bodies, but a deliberate, practiced technique. First, they meticulously brushed all the loose snow and ice from their outer Veafelder cloaks. They had to start as dry as possible. Any melting snow would rob them of heat. Then they organized the huddle. The Filgia, or hunting dog, was called over. The animal, itself a significant source of warmth with its thick fur, was directed to lie down on the pine boughs. The human arrangement was based on one simple principle: protect the most vulnerable. Kettle, as the youngest and smallest, would lose heat the fastest. He was placed in the middle, his back against the warm, breathing flank of the dog. Bjorn settled on one side of Kettle, and Astrid on the other. They pressed in close, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, minimizing every possible inch of exposed surface area. This was not a matter of comfort or modesty. It was a matter of mathematics, of conserving every precious degree of heat. The psychological comfort was just as important as the physical warmth. The feeling of another person's body pressed against yours was a powerful anchor. It was a stark, living contrast to the dead cold of the air on their faces. It was a profound statement: you are not alone. In this shared fate, this communal trust, they might have felt a sense of their Filgia, not just as a follower, but as a collective spirit of survival. They were not done. To complete the shelter, Bjorn and Astrid took their own large, shaggy cloaks and, like a sleeping bag, created a shared envelope. They draped the heavy, fur-like wool over all of them, dog included. This final layer trapped their combined body heat and breath, creating a small, humid microclimate under the cloaks. Inside this huddle, the world vanished. The only visual was the tiny, glowing blue vent hole, their single connection to the outside world. The only sounds were the muffled, rhythmic breathing of the group. The only smells were the intimate ones of damp wool, of dog, and of human closeness. They would not sleep, not truly, not all at once. They would sleep in shifts. Astrid, her senses sharp, would remain half awake. Her task was twofold. She had to periodically check the vent hole, ensuring the drifting snow of the blizzard did not seal it, silently starving them of air. Her other task was to listen to the breathing of the others, to monitor their status. They would talk quietly to keep their spirits up. Bjorn might tell a story, his voice low and rumbling. Astrid might sing a KVD, a short, quiet song, her voice muffled by the wool. This was not just for comfort, it was a diagnostic tool. As long as they could talk, as long as their speech was clear, they were safe. If someone's words began to slur, if they became too quiet, that was the first, terrifying sign of deep hypothermia. The others would then be tasked with shaking them, rubbing their limbs, forcing them back from the brink. To sleep this way required a profound, unspoken trust. They were, quite literally, putting their lives in each other's hands. Warmed by their miraculous gear, by the dog, and by each other, they were prepared to wait out the storm. They began to drift into a state of semi-sleep, a watchful quiet, their minds turning inward. As they huddle for warmth, the barrier between the waking world and the world of stories begins to blur. What do you think would be the most difficult part of this experience? The cold, the darkness, or the waiting? Let me know your thoughts as we settle in for the long night. The crisis has passed. The roaring wind, the biting snow, the desperate scramble to build, all of this has faded. Inside the snow shelter, a new phase has begun. This is not the phase of action, but of endurance. The pace of the world slows, drawing down to the rhythm of breathing in a small, dark space. Here, in the deep quiet of the buried world, we find the true heart of survival. It is not a panic, but a watchful, patient, and accepting calm. This is the lost mindset of the ancient North. What does it truly feel like to be in this situation? The three hunters, Leaf, Astrid, and Kettle, are cocooned in stillness. The world outside has vanished, replaced by the muffled, heavy presence of the snow all around them. Their fear is not gone, but it has settled, transforming from a sharp panic into a dull, low-thrumming awareness. The primary feeling now is one of profound, watchful patience. They have done everything they can. They have used their wisdom, their tools, and their strength. Now they must wait. This state of profound calm is rooted deep in the Norse worldview. They held a powerful concept of fate, known sometimes as word or orlog. This was not a passive belief, but a practical one. It was the understanding that some things are simply outside of one's control. They had made their choices. They had built their shelter well. The rest was up to the weave of destiny. This acceptance did not mean giving up. It meant they could release their minds from the why and focus completely on the now. And the now had one great, silent danger: sleep. Not the restful sleep of home, but the cold sleep, the treacherous, seductive drowsiness of hypothermia. This is the sleep from which you do not wake. It comes as a feeling of false warmth, a comfortable numbness, an overwhelming desire to just close your eyes for a moment. To surrender to this sleep was to surrender to death. The cold did not just attack the body, it tricked the mind. This is why they must not all sleep at once. They would sleep in shifts, a vital, shared duty. Leaf might rest his head for a time, while Astrid and Kettle remained awake, talking quietly. They would speak of mundane things, of the farm, of a memory from summer. These words were anchors, tethers to the conscious world. Their goal was the warm sleep, a short, protected rest, guarded by the wakefulness of companions. A hand on the shoulder would wake the next person, ensuring the watch never failed. In the shelter, time itself began to distort. The darkness was absolute, so complete it felt thick and heavy, like a physical weight. Without the sun, without any change in light, the hours blurred into one long, continuous night. Was it an hour? Was it a day? It was impossible to know. The only clock was the rhythm of their own bodies, the sound of breathing, the faint, dull thump of one's own heartbeat, seeming to echo in the profound, muffled silence. To anchor themselves against this sensory deprivation, they relied on small rituals. These were the tiny, practical tasks that kept them present. Kettle would periodically check the small vent hole they had poked in the roof. He would feel for the faint, cold draft, ensuring it had not become blocked by new snow. A blocked vent meant the air would grow stale, and the cold sleep would come even faster. This small act was a lifeline. Another ritual was the sharing of food, not a meal, but a token. Astrid might break off a small strip of dried fish. They would chew it slowly, the tough, salty fibers, a powerful reminder of the living world. The taste was sharp, real. It was an affirmation. We are still here. They might whisper a story, a short kenning, or a memory of a child's first steps. These were not grand speeches, but tiny threads of connection, weaving them together in the dark. This entire experience is the lost mindset. It is an absolute acceptance of hardship, not with resentment, but with practicality. The question was never, why me? That question was useless. The only question that mattered was what now? And the answer was simple. What now? Wiggle your toes. What now? Check the vent. What now? Listen to your companion breathe. It was a mindset of radical focus on the immediate, practical, and possible. This was not a detachment from the world. In fact, it was the opposite. It was a profound connection to the land. They were not separate from this landscape. They were part asterisk of it. They were not intruders fighting the snow. They had borrowed the snow, using its own properties to create a shield. They were enduring just as the ancient stones beneath them endured. They were a part of the winter, not its victims. This understanding brought its own quiet strength. When one of them did manage to find that warm sleep, their dreams would be extraordinarily vivid. In the total absence of external stimuli, the inner world would bloom with powerful, clear images. These dreams were not idle fantasies. They were often seen as important, as omens, or even as interactions with the spiritual world. A hunter might dream of their Philgia, their personal spirit guardian, perhaps appearing as a wolf or a bear, offering a silent nod of reassurance. This, then, was the quiet courage of endurance. It is a form of Viking strength that is entirely distinct from the loud, fiery myth of the berserker warrior. This was not the strength to charge into battle. This was the strength to sit still. It was the strength to face the overwhelming and to instead focus on the small. It was the strength to wait, to trust in one's knowledge, and to keep your companions alive. This calm was their sharpest, most vital tool. The silence was almost a sound in itself. The only thing to break it was the faint rustle of their wool clothing, or the whisper of their own breath. In this quiet, other senses grew sharp. The air had a distinct, cold, mineral smell, and beneath that, another scent. It was the faint, sweet, hay-like smell of the sennegrass they used to line their boots. This dried grass was a remarkable insulator, and its scent was a tiny, ghostly reminder of the green, warm summer. To fight the numbness, they would consciously move. They would wiggle their toes inside their boots, feeling the soft sennegrass compress. They would curl and uncurl their fingers, forcing the blood to move. This was a constant, low-level effort, a quiet fight against the encroaching cold. They would melt a small handful of snow in their mouths, the water metallic and sterile, but necessary. Each sip was a small victory against the creeping dehydration. The darkness remained their constant companion. It was a presence. It insulated them, but it also isolated them. Their world had shrunk to this tiny bubble of warmth, a space perhaps no larger than a small wagon. Their survival depended entirely on what they had brought with them and what they knew. This profound, patient, and practical mindset was built on a deep ancestral knowledge. It was a trust, not just in fate, but in the materials of their world, materials they understood with generations of observation. While their woolen clothing formed the base of their protection, it was fur that served as their ultimate shield against the deep cold. Wool was the workhorse, but fur was the lifesaver, a luxury of function. The hunters, in their small shelter, were likely sitting not directly on the snow, but on a sleeping skin, a large reindeer hide laid flat. This hide was their vital insulation from the frozen floor. The Norse and their neighbors knew that not all furs were created equal. They prized the hides of reindeer, wolf, bear, and wolverine. Each had a specific, powerful purpose. The reindeer hide was perhaps the most remarkable. This was a lesson learned from their neighbors, the Sami people, who were the undisputed masters of Arctic survival. The Sami knew that reindeer hairs are hollow, like thousands of tiny, microscopic straws. These hollow fibers trap air, creating one of the most effective natural insulators on Earth. This reindeer hide beneath them was a piece of natural technology. It was their barrier, preventing their own body heat from melting the snow floor and soaking them in icy water. It was a byproduct of hunting for meat. In the Norse world, every part of the animal was used. The hunt was a sacred exchange, providing food, bone for tools, and the fell, or hide, for warmth. If you looked at Astrid's hood, you might see it was lined with a different fur. It would be wolverine. This was another piece of highly specialized ancestral knowledge. Wolverine fur is prized for one unique quality. It resists frosting up from human breath. As Astrid exhaled, the moisture that would instantly freeze into a thick, icy crust on wool or even wolf fur would simply bead on the wolverine fur and fall away. This kept her face clear and protected from frostbite. Fur was often used as the outermost layer, the verifeldur, or pelt cloak. This was more than just a garment. It was a sign of wealth, status, and prowess. A man who wore a bearskin cloak was a man of great strength and a successful hunter. A gray wolf's pelt was a sign of cunning. But in the shelter, these furs were pure function. They were the outer shell, blocking the wind and shedding the snow. Other hides had their uses. Sealskin, common in coastal communities, was valued for its incredible water resistance, perfect for life on the cold sea. Bear fur, thick and deep, was immensely warm, though heavy. The hunters in our story would be wrapped in their wool, and perhaps an outer cloak of fur, huddled together on the reindeer hide. Their world was a small cocoon of wool and fur. The hides themselves held the memory of their preparation. They were not tanned with modern chemicals, but with simple, effective methods. Some were brain tanned, using the animal's own brain matter to soften the skin, a process that yields a soft, supple, smoke-colored leather. Others might be tanned using willow bark, a slow process that stained the hide a rich, reddish brown. And so, sitting in the dark, the hunters would be surrounded by these materials. They would feel the dense, soft underfur of a wolf pelt and the long, slick guard hairs that shed the snow. They would smell the faint, smoky, leathery scent of the brain-tanned hide. In the intense cold, the leather would be stiff, making a distinct crinkling sound with every small movement. The different colors and textures, the deep brown of bear, the gray-white of wolf, were a palette of survival. There was also a spiritual aspect to this. To wear the skin of a powerful animal, like a bear or a wolf, was thought to grant the wearer some of its strength, its spirit. It was a way of honoring the animal, of carrying its power with you. In the dark shelter, this connection would be a quiet comfort. They were wrapped in the strength of the wild, borrowing its warmth to survive. This knowledge, this intimate understanding of wool, grass, fur, and snow, is what kept them alive. The long night, which had no measure, wore on. The blizzard's roar outside, which had been a deafening scream, had long since faded to a dull rumble. And then it faded further, until it was gone entirely. The world outside the shelter fell into a new, profound silence. The silence was the change. It was different from the muffled quiet of the storm. This was the silence, asterisk after asterisk, the storm. It was absolute, heavy and still. It was this new quiet that woke them. Leaf, whose turn it was to watch, shifted. He crawled to the small vent hole and cleared it. He looked, expecting the familiar blackness. But it was not black. It was a pale, gray blue, the faintest, purest light. The storm had broken. It was morning. They had survived the night. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over them. It was not a cheer, but a long, slow exhale. They were stiff. Their bodies ached with a deep, penetrating cold. They were dehydrated, their mouths dry, but they were alive. The relief was so powerful it was almost a form of exhaustion itself. But the work was not over. They could not simply emerge. They needed energy. They would eat their remaining hard food. Astrid passed around the last of the stockfisk, the dried cod, and Kettle shared his reindeer jerky. Chewing the tough, salty food was hard work, but it was vital. It was fuel, building a small fire of energy deep inside them before they faced the cold and the digging. The entrance to their shelter was gone. It was completely buried, sealed by the storm. They would have to dig asterisk up asterisk. Leaf took his ski, a tool that had already saved them, and began to push at the plug of snow that sealed their burrow. He pushed up through the new, compacted drift. It was heavy, but it was looser than the wind-packed wall. He pushed again, and with a soft whoosh, the plug gave way. Light, not the gentle gray-blue of the vent hole, but a brilliant, sudden, asterisk, blinding, asterisk white. It flooded the small, dark space, and all three hunters squinted, throwing their hands up to shield their eyes. After the long, total darkness, the light was painful, sharp, but it was the light of the living world. They crawled out, one by one, emerging from their snow cocoon. They stood, and they blinked. The world they knew was gone. In its place was an alien landscape, a new world sculpted by the wind. The familiar shapes of rocks and small trees were gone, buried under smooth, flowing drifts of white. The sun was low, just rising. and it caught the surface of the new snow, making it sparkle with a million points of light, like diamond dust. The beauty was breathtaking, but it was also dangerous. The sun blindness, what we now call snow blindness, was a serious threat. The intense glare from the new snow could quickly burn their eyes, leaving them unable to see. But Kettle, the old and wise one, was prepared for this. He brought out his sneebriller, or snow goggles. They were a simple, beautiful piece of technology. These were not glass. They were a small, curved piece of wood, or perhaps antler bone, carved to fit over the eyes. In the center of each eyepiece was not a lens, but a single, narrow, horizontal slit. Kettle put them on, and the blinding world was reduced to a clear, manageable band of light. It cut the glare completely, allowing him to see. He had likely made a pair for the others as well. The three of them stood in the vast, still, white world. The air was perfectly still, and so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no wind, just the sound of their own movements, the crunch of their boots on the fresh snow. The deep, aching cold in their bones was still there, but it was forgotten, overshadowed by the overwhelming, quiet joy of survival. They did not speak for a long time. Leaf, Astrid, and Kettle simply looked at each other. It was a shared look that needed no words. It was a bond, forged in the darkness and the cold, a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. They had faced the void, and they had won, not with battle axes, but with wisdom, patience, and trust. Then the lost mindset returned. The relief was replaced by the next immediate task. What now? They needed to find their bearings. The landscape was alien. Every familiar marker was hidden, but the sun was rising. They could use that. Kettle, with his protected eyes, scanned the horizon, looking for the high, familiar ridges, now softened by snow, that would point the way home. The hunters are alive. They will find their way. They will make it back to the Inmark, the protected lands of their settlement. Their story, the story of the crisis in the Utmark, the wildlands, is over. But their story is just one example of this constant, quiet negotiation with the northern winter. It is a doorway into their world, a chance to understand the bedrock of their lives, the place of warmth and safety they were fighting to return to. We leave them on their journey home, and we travel, as if on that still cold air, to the place they were trying to reach. We arrive at the Inmark, the heart of their world. In the distance, we see the ideal winter scenario, the haven they dreamed of in the snow shelter. We see the Viking longhouse. It does not look like a building. It looks like a part of the earth. It is a long, low, ship-like mound, rising from the snow-covered fields. The Langhus, the longhouse, was the center of Norse life, their fortress against the cold. These buildings could be massive, sometimes 15 meters wide and over 75 meters long. They were masterpieces of practical, organic engineering, built to work with the wind, not against it. Its walls were gently curved, a trick learned from shipbuilding, designed to brace the structure against the powerful gales of the north. The frame was a heavy internal skeleton of timber, a stave or post and lintel construction. But the walls themselves were not wood. In these cold regions, they were often made of thick turf bricks, cut directly from the earth and stacked high. The roof was a marvel of insulation. First, a layer of birch bark was laid over the timbers, acting as a perfect waterproof membrane. On top of this, a thick layer of sod or grass turf was laid. In the summer, this roof would be green and alive, with grass and flowers. But now, in deep winter, the sod was hidden beneath another layer, a deep, insulating blanket of snow, which had settled on the roof and stayed. We see only a long, grass-covered mound in the snow, a single, lazy plume of smoke rising from a vent in its center. The longhouse was often divided into two main sections. The scully, or main hall, was where the people lived, ate, and slept. The other end was the fuse, the byre, or stable. This was another stroke of genius in the design. During the deep winter, the farm's animals, the cattle, the sheep, were brought inside the longhouse. They lived in the fuse, safe from the predators and the cold. This did more than just protect the livestock. The combined body heat from these large animals generated a significant, constant, and free source of warmth for the entire building. This warmth permeated the structure, keeping the worst of the frost at bay. As we approach, the sound of the wind, which might be howling on the ridges, is muffled and distant, blocked by the thick, earthy walls. The house smells of damp sod, of the faint, musky scent of livestock, and the sharp, clean smell of wood smoke. It feels like a living house, breathing and settling under its heavy blanket of snow. There is only one entrance, a single, heavy, wooden door, a portal between the wild, cold, and the human world. And so, Leaf, Astrid, and Kettle emerge from their snow cocoon into a world reborn in white. They survived not with magic, and not with iron, but with wool, wisdom, and a profound, quiet trust in each other. Their story, the crisis of the blizzard, is over, but it offers us a doorway into their world, a chance to understand the bedrock of their lives, the place they return to. I hope this part of their journey has brought you some peace. If you're still with me, perhaps share a time you felt a similar sense of profound quiet or stillness in nature. For now, though, just let your mind drift as we explore the warm, safe world they called home. We have left the frozen paths and the desperate struggle for survival behind. The narrative of the hunt, of the dangerous journey, is now complete. Our pace slows, the tension releases, and we have arrived at our destination. We are seeking shelter, and we have found it. We are now inside the longhouse, in the deep dark of a Scandinavian winter, but we are no longer cold. This is a different part of the story, a soothing exploration of how life and sleep were not just possible, but even comfortable. This is the ideal winter scenario, a sanctuary carved from wood and earth. We are going to take a gentle, atmospheric tour of this refuge, focusing on the sights, the sounds, and the smells of the home that kept the darkness at bay. The air itself feels different in here. It is thick, but it is warm. The howling of the wind outside is now a distant, muffled sound, a reminder of the safety we have found. We are surrounded by the low murmur of voices, the scent of smoke and stew, and the gentle, living light of the fire. Let us begin our tour at the very center of this world, the heart of the longhouse. This heart was the Langyield, the Longfire. This was not a small, personal fireplace tucked into a wall. It was the central artery of the home, a long, rectangular hearth lined with stones, running down the very center of the main hall. All of life, all warmth, and all light radiated from this single, vital feature. The hearth itself was a careful construction. It was built from large, flat stones, chosen for their resilience and their ability to absorb and hold heat. These stones would be gathered from a riverbed or a field and laid with care to create a shallow, contained bed for the flames. It was the anchor of the entire structure. the foundation of domestic life. Its central placement was a brilliant piece of simple, effective engineering. Unlike a modern wall fireplace, which throws heat in only one direction, the Langold radiated its warmth in 360 degrees. It warmed the entire cavernous space. No one was truly far from its influence. It made the longhouse a truly communal room, with no single head of the table when it came to warmth. But what did this fire burn? In the great dense forests of Norway and Sweden, the fuel was hardwood. Oak and birch were preferred. These woods are dense, and they burn long and hot, creating a bed of excellent, glowing coals. The sound of splitting this heavy wood in the autumn was the sound of preparing for survival. In other lands, this was not an option. In places like Iceland or the north of Scotland, trees were scarce or non-existent. Here, the fuel was cut from the earth itself. It was peat. This was dried turf, rectangles of soil, and compressed vegetation, which were cut from the bogs in summer and stacked to dry. Peat burned with a different character. It was a smokier, heavier, more pungent and earthy scent. Now we must consider the great problem of any indoor fire, the smoke. The longhouse had no chimney, not in the way we would recognize one. There was no stone-lined flue to channel the smoke cleanly away. The smoke simply did what smoke does. It rose. It billowed up from the long fire, seeking the highest point of the roof. Its escape was a feature called the lore. This was, in its simplest form, a hole in the roof. Often, it was a long, narrow opening, or a series of smaller holes running the length of the long fire below. It was a necessary and imperfect compromise. It let the smoke out, but it could also let the weather in. For this reason, the lyre was often covered, not with glass, but with a clever, translucent frame. This frame might be covered with a stretched animal hide, perhaps a pig's bladder, scraped until it was thin and pale. This covering kept out the worst of the snow and the driving wind, but it also allowed a weak, filtered, milky light to enter the hall during the day. The air inside the longhouse, as a result, would have been very smoky. This was not a clean, clear atmosphere. The smoke did not vent perfectly. It would eddy and swirl in the currents of air, lingering in a thick cloud near the ceiling. People learned to live low. They sat on low benches. They slept on low platforms. To stand at full height was to put your head into a stinging, acrid cloud. But this constant, thick smoke had an unintended, positive side effect. It coated everything in the upper reaches of the hall. The great timber rafters were not the color of fresh wood. They were a deep, velvety, greasy black, stained with decades of soot. This layer of soot, this creosote, preserved the wood. It sealed it from moisture and repelled wood-boring insects, preventing rot. In the depths of winter, this fire was never allowed to go out. This was, first, a practical duty. To restart a fire from embers in the damp, freezing cold was a difficult, frustrating task. It was far easier to bank the coals at night and feed it new life in the morning. But it was also a sacred duty. The fire was the spirit of the home. It was the family's living anchor against the endless, pressing dark. This fire was also the primary source of light. We must understand that this was a world of deep shadow. The light was not bright and white, illuminating every corner. It was a living, moving, flickering orange glow. It cast huge, dancing shadows on the timber walls. It made the familiar world of the home seem mysterious and alive. This light was sometimes supplemented by smaller, simpler lamps. These were known as kohler. They were often just a shallow bowl, carved from soapstone or shaped from clay. The fuel was not olive oil, but rendered fish oil, or the blubber from a seal. A piece of dried moss would serve as a wick. These lamps gave a guttering, smoky, and rather pungent light. And finally, the long fire was the kitchen. Suspended over the flames, on a heavy iron chain or a tripod, hung the great cauldron. This pot was the center of the family's nourishment. In it simmered the sod, the perpetual stew. It was, quite literally, never empty. As portions were ladled out, new ingredients and more water were added. Let us pause and simply exist in this space. The visual is one of warmth. The low, flickering orange light is all around. You see it reflecting on the faces of the people gathered near. You see it catch a bright, sudden glint off a piece of bronze jewelry or a polished glass bead breathed in the air. It is not just one smell, but a complex tapestry of aromas. There is the sharp, resinous, comforting smell of the wood smoke itself. Woven into that is the rich, fatty scent of roasting meat and the green, bright smell of herbs like angelica or thyme simmering in the stew. Listen to the sounds. The longhouse is not silent. It is filled with the voice of the fire. You hear the sharp crackle and hiss of sap caught in a log. You hear the gentle, constant bubbling of the stewpot, a promise of food. Feel the warmth. It is not the dry, blasting heat of a modern furnace. It is a radiant warmth. You feel it on your face, on your palms, as you hold them out. It is a welcome, living presence, a shield against the profound cold that you know is waiting just on the other side of the wall. And look up, watch the smoke itself. It does not rush out. It gathers in lazy, gray-blue smoke wreaths. It drifts slowly, catching the light, moving in currents towards the dark, soot-stained rafters high above your head. It is a slow, hypnotic dance. The fire has warmed the air, and it has filled the cauldron. This heat makes life possible. But where did people rest? Where did they sleep in this smoky, communal, and busy space? We now explore the simple, clever furniture that made sleep possible, and even comfortable. We move away from the central fire towards the long walls of the hall. Here we find the sleeping arrangements. Where did people actually sleep? The answer, for most, was on the pallor. These were not individual, separate beds. They were wide, raised wooden platforms, or benches, that ran along both of the long walls. These benches were a permanent feature of the longhouse architecture. They were, in effect, the living room. During the short, dim days, people sat on them. They would work here, talk here, and eat here. And at night, these very same benches transformed into the communal sleeping platform for the entire household. But why were they raised? This was not for decoration. It was a simple and brilliant adaptation to the realities of the longhouse environment. The floor itself was just hard-packed earth. It was cold. Cold air is heavy, and it sinks. It would settle on the floor, creating chilling drafts that snaked around your ankles. The pallor raised the sleepers a crucial 2 or 3 feet above this layer of cold air. They slept in the warmer, clearer air that circulated in the middle of the room, closer to the radiant heat of the long fire. It was a simple, passive, and effective way to stay warm. Of course, not all spots on the pallor were created equal. The prime sleeping spot was on this raised bench, but as close as possible to the life-giving warmth of the langeld. The head of the household, the chieftain or farmer, and their immediate family would claim this central, warmest position. So, what made this hard wooden platform comfortable for a long winter's night? Bedding. There were no thick, soft mattresses. The base layer, spread thickly upon the wooden planks, was straw, dry, rustling straw, piled deep to provide a cushion. In some regions, they used sweet-smelling heather, which had the added benefit of repelling insects. On top of this straw or heather base, they laid animal fells. These were the cured skins of animals with the fur or wool still on. Most common were sheepskins, thick with their natural wool. But they also used the incredibly warm hides of reindeer, or the soft pelts of fox or wolf. These fells were soft, heavy, and trapped the body's heat wonderfully. To cover themselves, they used blankets known as feldur. These were thick, shaggy wool blankets. They were often woven from coarse, oily wool. In fact, the cloaks they wore during the day, the veilfelder, often doubled as their blankets at night. A person's cloak was their bedding. These blankets were heavy, rich with natural lanolin, and almost waterproof. In some longhouses, however, there was another, more private option. This was especially true in later Viking periods, or in the homes of wealthier families. This was the lakricha, which translates to shutbed or lockbed. What was a shutbed? It was a marvel of thermal efficiency and a rare island of privacy. It was an enclosed wooden box bed. It might be built directly into the timber framing of the wall, or it might stand freely like a large cabinet. It was, in essence, a small room within a room, built just for sleeping. These shut beds had solid wooden doors that could be closed, or at the very least, thick curtains that could be drawn. This simple feature offered to things that the open parlor could not. The first and most obvious was privacy. In a communal hall where 30 or 40 people lived and slept, this was a rare luxury. But the second reason was far more important. The shut bed asterisk trapped body heat asterisk with extreme effectiveness. A couple, or a group of small children, sleeping inside one of these small, enclosed boxes would be incredibly warm. They would be breathing their own heated air, safe from every draft, in their own tiny microclimate. We often imagine people sleeping as we do, lying perfectly flat. But evidence suggests many people slept sitting up, or at least propped at an angle. They would lean against the cold timber wall of the longhouse, or against the wooden back of the shut bed. They used a bolster, a thick cushion stuffed with straw or wool to support their back. Let us imagine settling down for the night. Feel the coarse, dry straw as it rustles beneath the soft fur of the sheepskin. Feel the comforting, immense weight of the shaggy wool feldur as you pull it up to your chin. It feels secure. Listen to the sounds of the sleeping house. The fire has died down to a bed of glowing red embers. The main sound is the rustling of bedding as someone turns over in their sleep. And, underneath that, the deep, slow, communal breathing of a household at rest. A soft snore, a cough, the quiet sounds of life. Look around in the dim, red-lit darkness. The hall is a world of shadows. The long benches are lined with dark, mounded shapes. These are the sleeping forms of the family, each wrapped in their heavy fells. It is a visual of profound, shared safety. Breathe in. What does the bedding smell of pine? It smells of the woody, resinous pine of the benches themselves. It smells of dry straw. If you are lucky, it smells faintly of the sweet, dried heather. It is a clean, earthy, dry smell, mixed with the ever-present, faint background of cold wood smoke. And finally, feel the sense of security. You are enclosed. You are on the raised platform above the cold. You are protected by the thick, strong timber wall at your back. You are under the great curving roof that holds back the snow. You are, perhaps, safe inside the wooden walls of a shut bed. You are part of a warm, breathing, living whole. They are warm, they are safe, they are fed, but the winter is long, and the darkness lasts for months. What did they actually do? This was not a time of hibernation. It was a time of quiet, essential, and constant work. The longhouse was not just a home, it was a factory. The daylight hours, if they came at all, were short and weak. The longhouse became the entire world. But it was not a sleepy, quiet world, waiting for spring. It was a busy, productive, and focused place. This was the season of work. The heavy labor of the farm was impossible. The ground was iron-hard with frost. The plows were stored. The ships were pulled ashore, safe from the sice. And so, all the work of the hands and the mind moved inside. The longhouse became a workshop, illuminated by the orange glow of the long fire. For the women of the household, the work was constant. Perhaps the most common sight, the most common activity, was spinning. Using a snilda, a simple drop spindle, women spun the wool that had been sheared in the autumn. Their hands were never still, rhythmically drawing out the fibers and twisting them into strong, warm yarn. This yarn was then taken to the loom. The Norse loom was not the horizontal kind we might imagine. It was a vertical opstad, or a warp-weighted loom. It was a tall, wooden frame that leaned against the wall. The vertical threads, the warp, were not held by a roller, but were pulled taut by a row of heavy, smooth stones. This loom had its own distinctive sound. The weaver would pass the shuttle, carrying the weft thread between the warp threads. Then they would use a wooden sword to beat that thread upwards, packing the cloth tight. The clack-clack of the wooden shuttle, and the gentle, stony thump of the loom's weights as they shifted, was a constant, comforting, domestic rhythm. This was not all. Clothes, worn hard by a year of labor, needed mending. New socks and mittens were always needed to fight the cold. These were not knitted. They were made using an older, slower, but incredibly strong technique called nalbinding. This was a form of looping done with a single, large needle made of bone or wood. And, of course, the work of the kitchen never ended. Food had to be prepared from its preserved state. The stockfish needed to be soaked. The bread needed to be baked. The perpetual stew needed to be tended. The men, too, had their work. With the fields frozen and the seas impassable, their hands turned to trescard, carving. With a simple, sharp knife, they would sit by the fire and turn blocks of wood into the necessities of life. They carved spoons for the stew. They carved bowls for the ale. They carved handles for their tools. But this carving went far beyond the purely practical. This long, dark, quiet time was an opportunity for art. A man might spend an entire winter patiently carving the intricate, swirling, animal-style designs on a new doorpost or on the panels of a new shut bed. It was a way to pass the darkness, to create beauty, and to leave a mark. This was also the great time for maintenance. Tools were repaired. An axe head, loosened in the autumn, was fitted with a new, stronger handle. Weapons were sharpened, their fine steel edges oiled against the damp air. New pairs of skis were carved and shaped. Rope, essential for the long ship, was twisted from strips of hide or strands of horsehair. If the longship itself was stored in a large shed nearby, or even in a special, extended part of the longhouse, this was the time for its care. Planks that had been strained by the sea were mended. The intricate carvings on the prow were restained. The heavy wool sail was patched and repaired. The ship was the key to their world, and it was cared for all winter. But perhaps the most important work of all was the work of the mind. Winter was the time for storytelling. The longhouse was not just a home and a workshop. It was a library, it was a school, and it was a theater, all in one. A traveling skald, a professional poet and storyteller might be a guest, trading his stories for food and warmth. More commonly, it was the family elder, the grandfather or grandmother, their face illuminated by the fire. They would recite the stories that everyone knew and that everyone needed to hear again. They told the sagas of their ancestors, the great deeds of heroes. They recited the complex, beautiful poems about the gods, about Thor and Odin. This is how they passed down their history. This is how they taught the law and ethics and mythology. This is how the culture itself survived the long, cold, dark. Let us listen again. Hear the sounds of this indoor work. Hear the rhythmic thump and clack of the warp-weighted loom. It is the steady heartbeat of the house. Listen closer. Hear the sound of a sharp knife. It is a gentle, whispering shave. The sound of a long, thin curl of wood being pulled from a piece of fresh birch. And underneath all of these domestic sounds, hear the sound of the human voice, the low, sonorous, rhythmic murmur of a story being told in Old Norse. It is the sound of memory itself being woven into the smoky air. Breathe in. The air is smoky, yes, but it also smells of the work. It smells of the lanolin, that natural, oily, animal scent of the warm wool that is being spun into yarn. It is a warm, domestic, and comforting smell. And look at the hands. The firelight illuminates them. You see hands, gnarled and strong, busy with a nail-bending needle, pulling the yarn through a loop. You see hands gripping a knife, guiding its edge, surely. You see hands holding a drop spindle, giving it a gentle twist, spinning, spinning, spinning. The work filled the days, and the stories filled the nights. But what fueled this constant work? What food kept these people warm from the inside out? Let us explore the simple, hearty, and preserved tastes of the Viking winter. We are warm, we are busy, and now we are hungry. How did a household eat for months when the world outside was frozen and barren? The winter diet was not about fresh ingredients. It was about preservation, fat, and life-sustaining warmth. The absolute center of this diet was the sod, the perpetual stew. That great iron cauldron, hanging over the long fire, was the focal point of every meal. It was a simmering, brothy, and incredibly hearty stew. It was the taste of home. What, exactly, was in this pot? It held the meat from the autumn slaughter, mutton, goat, or perhaps game like venison or boar. And it held the vegetables that could last in a cold cellar. Root vegetables, turnips, onions, and hearty cabbage. It simmered for days on end, always being topped up, always evolving. Fish was a great staple, the protein of the north. Stockfish, especially air-dried cod, was the food of survival. It was caught in spring and hung on great wooden racks. The cold, dry northern air cured it until it was as hard as a board. It would last for years. To be eaten, it had to be broken up, maybe even hammered, and added to the stew to soften. But not all fish was dried. Some was preserved by curing. Gravlax, a name which literally means grave salmon, was a delicacy. Fresh salmon was cured with a mixture of salt, sugar, and dill. This method of preservation, burying it in the cold earth for a time, gave it a unique, delicate, and prized flavor. They needed bread to go with the stew, but leavened bread was difficult. The common bread was flat broad. This was a simple, hard flatbread made from tough grains like rye or barley. It was baked to be perfectly dry so that it would last all winter in a barrel without growing mold. It was a hard, dry, crunchy vehicle for the stew. Milk was plentiful in the summer, but not in the winter, so milk was preserved. Skyr was a thick, tangy, cultured dairy product. It was very similar to a thick yogurt or a fresh cheese. It preserved the milk's precious protein and fat for the dark months. It was a sour, cooling counterpoint to the rich, salty stew. What did they drink? They drank fresh water, melted from snow. But they also drank beverages that were, themselves, a source of calories and preservation. Majod, or mead, was a sweet, strong wine made from fermented honey, and all, or ale. This ale was not a light, clear drink. It was a thick, dark, nutritious, and cloudy beer. It was often called liquid bread, and it was food as much as it was a drink. Sweetness was a rare and precious taste. It came from honey when it could be found, and it came from preserved berries, tart lingonberries, and prized orange cloudberries. These were gathered in a flurry in the late autumn and stored simply. They were kept in barrels of cold water or preserved in precious honey. They were a bright, sharp taste of summer in the dead of winter. The main source of meat, of course, was from the autumn slaughter. The animals that could not be fed through the winter were butchered. This meat was preserved. Hams and joints were packed in salt. They were smoked high in the rafters, in the very smoke from the long fire. They hung there all winter, slowly curing, slowly darkening. The most important single part of the diet was fat. In our modern world, we are taught to avoid it. For the people of the longhouse, fat was life. Large amounts of animal fat were eaten. It provided the essential, dense energy, the internal furnace that was required to fight the cold and fuel a day of work. The stew was rich with fat. So, what was the dominant taste of the winter? It was not subtle. It was the taste of salt, the great preservative. It was the taste of smoke, which cured the meat and filled the air. And it was the sharp, green flavor of dried herbs, like angelica or thyme, that were gathered in summer and added to the pot to bring a memory of the forest. Let us use our senses one last time. The dominant smell in the longhouse is the simmering sod. It is a rich, brothy, and deeply smoky aroma. It fills the entire space. It is the smell of warmth, safety, and sustenance. Imagine the taste. You take a piece of the dark, heavy, dry rye flatbread. You break it and you dip it into the hot stew. The bread softens, soaking up the rich, fatty broth. It is simple, it is salty, and it is a profoundly satisfying taste. Someone pours a drink. You smell the sweet, fermented, almost floral scent of mead being poured from a drinking horn. It is a smell of celebration, of community, and of good cheer. Listen, hear the sound of a knife scraping against the hard, dry, pale flank of a stockfish. Flakes of the dried fish fall like wood shavings onto a wooden board, ready to be added to the pot. It is a dry, percussive, working sound. And look up, one last time, past the lazy wreaths of smoke. In the deep shadows of the rafters, you can see them. the dark, heavy shapes of smoked hams, the long, pale, ghost-like bodies of dried fish. They hang there, a pantry in the ceiling, a promise of food for all the months to come. This life, full of work, food, and stories, was a small, warm island of light in a vast sea of cold and dark. The longhouse was truly a microcosm of the Norse world. It was a small island of warmth, light, and industry, huddled against a vast and cold darkness. The work of their hands and the stories on their lips were their anchors against the ice. This profound connection between the cold, the dark, and the imagination is our final path to explore. I hope this look into their homes has made you feel cozy and safe. If you are still awake, perhaps you can share a craft or hobby that brings you comfort in the winter, but there is no need to reply. Just let that thought drift as we drift together into the myths born of this very ice. The world of these ancient hunters was born from ice. It is no wonder, then, that their entire worldview, their cosmology, and their deepest fears were all carved from it. To understand their mindset, to truly feel the world as they did, we must drift into the stories they told, the myths that gave a voice to the cold. This is the why of their fear and their resilience. It is a story not of history, but of imagination, a final, sleepy exploration for those of us still listening. Let us drift back, not just centuries, but to the very beginning of all things. Before the world, before the gods, before the first human, there was not just darkness. There was not just an empty void. In the very beginning, there were two realms, two great poles of existence, separated by a vast and silent gap. These two realms were the primal opposites of all creation, the first great forces waiting to meet. One was a place of impossible, ancient heat. The other, a place of impossible, ancient cold. To the south, there was Muspelheim. This was the land of fire. It was a place of eternal light, a searing, roaring inferno that burned without fuel. It was filled with soot and embers and a sky made of red and orange flame. Here, sparks danced in the hot air like fireflies, and rivers of molten rock carved paths through the burning landscape. It was a place of noise, of crackling and roaring, a place of intense, creative, and destructive energy, guarded by its own fiery giants. To the north, there was the opposite. There was Niflheim. This was the world of mist, the land of primordial ice. Unlike the roaring south, Niflheim was a place of profound, heavy silence. It was a realm of deep, abyssal cold, a place of fog and shadow. From a central spring, a great fountain of water bubbled, but its mists froze as they rose, covering everything in layers of frost. It was a still, waiting world, a place of deep, cold potential, shrouded in a permanent, gray twilight. And between these two, between the fire and the ice, lay the great chasm. This was Gnungop, the gaping void, the yawning gap. It was not a place. It was the absence of a place. It was a vast, formless, and silent emptiness, stretching further than any mind could imagine. It held no light, no darkness, no sound, no substance. It was pure, elemental nothingness, the space where the two great powers of fire and ice would one day meet. From the great spring in the center of Niflheim, a place called Hverg Olmir, 11 great rivers flowed. These were known as the Illevager, the ice waves, but they did not carry water as we know it. They carried a cold, venomous substance, a primal poison known as eider. This was the very essence of cold, a biting, acidic liquid that was colder than ice itself. These 11 rivers flowed out of Niflheim and poured over the edge into the northern reaches of the great void, Ginnen. As this venomous water, this ichor, flowed into the absolute zero of the void, it did not remain liquid. It began to freeze. It solidified, layer upon layer, over uncounted ages. This frozen venom was called Hrym, or Rhymes. Slowly, silently, the northern part of Ginnungagap began to fill. Great glaciers of glittering, poisonous ice advanced southward. The void was no longer empty. It was filling with a vast, dark, and frozen mass. We can imagine the sound, a slow, massive, echoing asterisk, crack asterisk, as the ice layers formed and settled in the deep silence. While the north filled with ice, the south, Muspelheim, continued to burn. It sent its own messengers into the void, great gusts of hot air carrying sparks and burning embers drifted north. This warm wind, full of the life and heat of the fire world, began to travel over the top of the frozen, venomous rime. The warmth from the south met the cold from the north. The air above the ice grew mild, like a spring breeze, and then the first great change occurred. The ice began to drip. The warmth from Muspelheim, gentle and persistent, began to melt the very top layers of the rime ice. The ichor, the primal venom, softened and liquefied. In the vast, silent cavern of the void, a new sound was heard. It was the slow, echoing, steady drip drip asterisk of melting ice. This was the first sound of creation. It was the sound of life beginning. From these drips, from the meeting of fire and ice, life began to form. The drops gathered and coalesced, and slowly a shape took form in the mist and slush. It was not a god. It was not human. It was the first being, a giant named Ymir. He was the ancestor of all Jotnar, all the giants. He was immense, a creature of chaos, born from the poisonous ice. He was not good nor evil. He simply was asterisk. As Ymir formed, so too did another creature. From the same life-giving drips, a great hornless cow emerged from the ice. Her name was Audhumla. She was the great mother, the provider. As she formed, her udders flowed with 4 rivers of milk, and the giant Ymir drank this milk to survive. He lay in the cold mist, nourished by the great cow, and from his own body more giants were born. But what did the cow Audhumla eat? She, in turn, began to lick the great blocks of salty rime ice that surrounded her. She was hungry, and the ice was her only sustenance. We can imagine the sound, a slow, rasping, rhythmic licking in the great void. For one day, she licked. For a second day, she licked. And on the third day, as she licked the salty stone, a form was revealed. First, the hair of a man, then a head, then a whole body. This was Buri. He was the first of the gods, the grandfather of the great god Odin, and so, in the very beginning, all life was born from the ice. The gods themselves were revealed from it, but the giants, the Jotnar, were formed from it. They were the first beings, the children of the venomous drips. It is no wonder, then, that in the minds of the Norse, the greatest enemies of the gods were, and always would be, the creatures of the cold. The world itself was born from ice. It is no wonder, then, that the greatest enemies of the gods were too. These giants, these Jotnar, needed a home, and so the gods gave them one, a realm of their own, far from the gods' own fortress of Asgard, and far from Midgard, our own world. This land was called Jotunheim, the home of the giants. It was a place that existed on the very edges of the known world, a physical place, but also a mythological one. It was the personification of the wilderness, the Utmark that those ancient hunters so deeply feared. Jotunheim was a land of Utengard. This word means outside the hedge, or beyond the fence. In the Norse mind, their own world Midgard was a safe, orderly enclosure. Asgard, the home of the gods, was the same, but Jotunheim was the chaos outside. It was the world of the untamable, the raw, the dangerous. It was a place where the laws of gods and men held no power. It was the world of the giants. If we were to take a dreamy, sleepy tour of Jotunheim, we would find ourselves under a cold blue light, a sky of permanent, heavy twilight. The sun and moon would be pale, distant things, their light struggling to pierce the thick gray clouds. The air itself would feel heavy and watchful and ancient. It would be a land of deep, profound silence, but not an empty silence. The landscape would be one of dark, brooding forests, endless tracts of pine and fir, their branches heavy with snow. As we walked, we would have the unsettling feeling of being watched, a feeling that eyes were upon us from the deep, silent shadows between the trees. The forest floor would be a maze of fallen rocks and deep snowdrifts, a place where it would be all too easy to become lost forever. And then there are the mountains. The mountains of Jotunheim would be so tall that their peaks are permanently hidden. They would be lost in a shroud of gray, swirling mist. These were not gentle, rolling hills. They were sharp, jagged peaks of black stone and blue ice. They were walls that separated the world of giants from the world of men. They were a constant, brooding presence on the horizon. In this land, the rivers do not flow. They are frozen solid. We would see them as great, captured waves of ice, silent and still. They would be bridges of frost, gleaming faintly in the cold blue light, but they would lead only to more cold, more stone, and more dark forests. The very water of this land was held in a state of permanent sleep, a deep, frozen stillness. And in this twilight world, we would hear sounds, far in the distance, a sudden, echoing crash, a sound that rolls through the valleys and shakes the very air. What was it? Was it an avalanche? A great sheet of ice and rock letting go from a high peak? Or was it the footstep of a giant striding from one mountain to the next? In Jotunheim, the terror is that they are one and the same, because the Jotnar, the giants, were not simply large people. They were the personification of these raw, untamable forces. They were the avalanche, they were the earthquake, they were the blizzard, and the deep, suffocating cold. The Rime-Thurser, the Rime giants, were the living embodiment of the winter storm. They were the biting wind, the blinding snow, the ice that froze the rivers. This mythology gave a face, and a story, to the formless terror of a winter storm. When a blizzard howled outside the longhouse, it was not just wind, it was the breath of a frost giant. When the ground trembled, it was a giant walking. This gave the people a way to understand and even confront the forces that threatened them. The giants themselves, in the stories, were often depicted as ancient, powerful, and elemental. They were made of ice and rock. Think of Skrymir, the giant, so vast that the god Thor and his companions mistook his glove for a hall and his snoring for an earthquake. Or think of Thrym, the giant king, who stole Thor's hammer and demanded the goddess Freya as his wife. a personification of the winter, holding the warmth, the hammer hostage. And so, the greatest enemy of the giants, and the greatest protector of humanity, was Thor. He was the god of thunder, the sky god, the wielder of the hammer, Mjolnir. His battles with the giants were the stories of the storm. The flash of his hammer was the lightning. The sound of it striking a giant's skull was the thunder. He was the force of order and warmth, pushing back against the encroaching chaos and cold. But the giants' power was not just brute force. Their main fortress, Utgard, was a place of deep magic. It was a castle of illusions. It was here that Thor himself was famously tricked. He was made to wrestle an old woman who was, in fact, old age. He tried to drink a horn that was connected to the sea. He tried to lift a cat that was actually the world serpent. The giants, like the winter, could trick the mind. They could make you feel small, weak, and foolish. They could create illusions, just as a whiteout blizzard can fool the eyes and the senses. This all points to a deep, seasonal fear. The giants' winter was the time of year when the forces of Jotunheim seemed strongest. It was the time when the Jutengard, the chaos, felt perilously close. It was the fear that the ice giants would grow too strong, that Thor would fail, and that the walls of Midgard would finally be overrun. The giants represented the present danger of winter, but there was also a future danger, a final, ultimate winter that haunted their imagination. The fear of the giants' winter was a seasonal one. It was the fear of the present. But the mythology also held a deeper, more profound terror. It spoke of a future winter, a final winter, a winter that would not end. This was the Fimbulvitr. In the old language, this translates to the mighty winter, or the great winter. What was this Fimbulvitr? In the prophecies, it was the first great sign. It was the trumpet blast to announce that the end of all things was near. It was the immediate herald of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the final, cataclysmic battle between the gods and the giants. When the Fimbulwinter began, all knew that the end had come. This was not just one hard, long winter. The prophecy said it would be three winters, all in a row. And there would be no summer in between, no spring, no thaw, no planting, and no harvest, just an endless, compounding, and deepening cold. The world would be choked by an ice age that arrived not over millennia, but in a single, terrible season that refused to leave. The stories described it in stark, simple terms. Snow will drift from all directions. It would be a blizzard that did not stop. A relentless storm coming from the north, the south, the east, and the west, all at once. The winds would be keen, the sagas say. They would be sharp, biting winds that cut through any wool, any wood, any stone. And there would be great frosts, a cold so deep it cracked the earth and the trees. During this great winter, the sun itself would falter. The goddess Sol, who drove the chariot of the sun, would grow weak. Her light would become a smoky dot in a sky of permanent gray gloom. The world would be cast in a half-light, and finally, the great wolf Skoll, who had hunted the sun since the beginning of time, would finally catch his prey. The sun would be swallowed. At the same time, the other wolf, Hati, would catch the moon, Mahani. The sky would go black. As the world was buried in snow and ice, the cold would find its way into the hearts of humanity. All social bonds, all kinship, all laws would break down. The sagas are grimly specific. Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters' sons will kinship stain. It would be a time of desperation, a war of all against all, driven by gnawing hunger and a profound, hopeless cold. The family in the longhouse, once a unit of survival, would turn on itself. This myth, as terrifying as it is not pure fantasy. It is the mythological articulation of a very real, very deep-seated fear. The fear of the famine winter. Our ancient hunters and the farmers who came after knew that a single failed harvest could mean starvation. A winter that lasted too long could mean the collapse of their entire society. The Fimbulvetr was this fear, magnified to its most logical, terrifying conclusion. And there may be a real-world seed for this myth. Scientists and historians point to a specific, catastrophic event, the volcanic winter of 536 AD, a massive eruption, or perhaps two, threw so much ash into the atmosphere that it created a dust veil. The sun was dimmed for well over a year. Temperatures plummeted globally. Crops failed from Ireland to China. This was a real, remembered time of darkness, cold, and famine. It is very possible that this terrifying, generation-scarring event was the inspiration for the mighty winter. The Fimbulvetr, then, is the ultimate expression of the cold fear that shaped the entire Norse mindset. It is the fear that the giants of ice and chaos will finally win. It is the primal anxiety, born from living so close to the edge, that one day the warmth might not return. It is the fear that the cycle of the seasons, the most fundamental promise of life, could be broken. Imagine the end of that third year. The winds have finally died down. The snow has stopped falling from the black sky. The world is buried. All landmarks are gone. All trees are broken. All longhouses are hidden under impossible drifts. And in the blackness, there is a profound end-of-the-world silence. The world is not dead. It is waiting for the final battle. This myth is the ultimate articulation of their relationship with the cold. It is a story of endings, ... But in the Norse world, every ending is also a new beginning. This myth, this story of the Fimbulvetr, is the ultimate articulation of their relationship with the cold. It is a vision of the end, a story of endings, of a world consumed by ice and darkness. But in the Norse worldview, in their cyclical understanding of time, every ending is also, inevitably, a new beginning. The end of one thing is simply the start of the next. And so, after Ragnarok, after the final battle, after the fire and the ice, the story does not truly end. The prophecy says that after the final battle, the old, scarred, and broken world will sink into the sea. It will be washed clean of all the blood, all the fire, and all the ice. It is a cleansing, a great, watery return to the void, a baptism for the world that is to come. And after a time, in the great, silent calm, new world will rise from the waves. This new world will be green and beautiful. It will be a land that has never known the bite of the frost giant, nor the shadow of the great wolves. The first thing to notice would be the smell of fresh, damp earth, the scent of new leaves on trees that have never been broken by snow, the clean, gentle smell of sea spray on a mild, calm shore. And then there would be sound, not the howling of the Fimbulvetr, but the sound of gentle waves lapping at the new land. And for the first time in an age, the sound of birdsong, clear and bright in the new air. The very atmosphere would feel different. It would be a feeling of clean, mild air, a gentle, welcome warmth that holds no threat, only comfort. What of the sky? The old sun's soul was devoured by the wolf. But the prophecy says she will have a daughter, a new son, just as bright and powerful as her mother. This new sun will rise over the green land, and its light will be pure and unwatched. There are no more wolves to hunt it. It is a new, safe, and eternal morning. A few of the gods survive this final ending. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, will walk this new green earth. But more importantly, there is a return from the underworld, from the realm of hell, to God's comeback. The gentle, beloved god, Balder, whose death was the first sign of the end, returns to the world of the living. And with him is his brother Hador, who killed him by accident. In this new world, they are reconciled. It is a land of peace, a land without the old grudges and old wounds. But what of humanity? The war and the winter wiped them all away. All except two. To humans survive the fire and the ice. Their names are Leaf and Lifthracer. These names mean life and the desirer of life. They are the new Adam and Eve of this green world. How did they survive? They did not fight in the great battle. They did not try to weather the Fimbulwinter. They hid. They found a safe refuge in a place called Hodmimir's Holt, or Hodmimir's Wood. This was a single, sacred grove that the ice and the fire could not touch. They slept through the destruction, hidden and safe. And what did they live on? What sustenance could carry them through the end of the world? The stories say they lived on nothing but the morning dew. This gentle, pure water was all they needed. And as the new world rises, we can imagine them. We can see Leaf and Lifthracer emerging from the dark wood into the bright, warm light of the first new morning. From these two, a new race of humanity will be born. They will repopulate this green and gentle land. They are not born from poison ice, but from the dew of a safe forest. They are not destined for a world of struggle against the cold, but for a world of peace, warmth, and new beginnings. The cycle ends, and the cycle begins again. The great cold recedes, and life, gentle and hopeful, returns. The story ends, as all nights must, with the promise of morning. This is the final thought for our journey. The Viking world was born of ice, defined by its struggle, and in their stories, finally cleansed by it. The long night of the Fimbulwinter gives way to a new dawn. And just as their world is reborn, our story for tonight comes to a gentle close. The hunters are safe in the longhouse. The long fire is burning low, and the myths of ice and giants have faded into dreams. I hope this journey into the frozen past has brought you comfort and quiet, and perhaps helped you on your own path to a restful sleep. If you've enjoyed our time together, please consider supporting the channel with a like, or subscribing to join our community for future stories. Thank you so much for listening to Sleeping Scribe. May your night be peaceful, your mind be calm, and may all your dreams be sweet. Good night.